if you want to understand rook and pawn endgames, then I think you should start with Alekhine against Capablanca, World Championship match 1927, the final game. Well, not only is this, to my eyes, the most important rook endgame, the most instructive rook and pawn endgame, but of course historically very important because Alekhine won this game to defeat Capablanca. I think the techniques that you learn from this endgame can be applied to so many others. So yeah, it's just very important. If you want to go deeper and find out more about rook and pawn endgames, then I very much recommend my chess-based download, PowerPlay 16 Test Your Rook Endgames, which is divided into 3 parts. Starts with some basic positions like Lucena, Philidor, that kind of thing. And then in the second section, I look at common scenarios such as an extra pawn on the wing. And then in the third section, I have a series of positions to test your knowledge and understanding. So there you go, PowerPlay 16, Test Your Rook Endgames. You can get it directly from the Chessbase shop online. Of course, this idea to look at Alekhine Capablanca, this classic endgame, was triggered by looking at the Women's World Cup final and the final game between Humpy Conero and Divya Deshmukh, which arrived at an endgame which had some similarities. But I think, if you know this blueprint of Alekhine Capablanca, it helps you, understand that endgame and many, many others. Okay, without further ado, let's take a look. Alekhine is a pawn up. There's the extra pawn. And crucially, he has the rook in the right position, behind the passed pawn. So if the black rook ever moves away, then that rook's pawn is an express train down to the promotion square. So this rook on a6 is passive. You might say that this rook is rather passive as well because it has to stay behind the pawn, but actually it has more freedom of movement. It can come down to any one of those squares, which might not seem significant at the moment, but actually comes into play later on, as we'll see, and is very significant. So we've got 3-3 on the king side, pawns matching each other. Remember that Divya exchanged rooks and she had a pawn on f4, and those shattered pawns actually should have made it easier for Humpy to find counterplay by creating a passed pawn. But this is very different. Now, what's White's winning technique here? Well, first of all, White would love to bring the king to b5, push the rook out of the way, and push the rook's pawn. So the king marches over. And Capablanca has to bring the king. There's no counterplay on the king side. h5, that's just waiting to see how White plays. King d3, still threatening to come here. King d5, king c3, king c5. So it feels like Alekhine is making no progress because the king has been blocked out by Black's king. But here is where the first very important technique comes. So you put Black into a kind of Zugzwang, and you can wait with that rook. That's the point. So the rook can move. Okay, let's look at Black's options. You don't want to move the rook, because then the pawn would just advance. Do you want to move the pawns on the king side? You could move the f-pawn, but, well, White will keep losing moves, and eventually those pawn moves will run out. And it's not clear that you really want to move the f-pawn, because that would weaken g6, and, yeah, not a good reaction. So really that leaves the king. No, you don't want to go that way, because that would allow White's king in. So king b5. King b3. Well, very important thing to note here is what's happening in the pawn endgame. So Capablanca just stepped to the side. What about rook takes pawn? Of course, we have to analyze this. Well, the point is that now white's king is able to dive over to the king side. Now, in fact, it's not possible to win a pawn straight away because black's king gets back in time. However, white's king is beautifully placed, and there's a very simple technique to disturb black's pawns, and that's to advance the f-pawn. So it gets to f5, exchange, and then the king will just shuffle across to win this pawn, and that's a very simple win. But that had to be calculated out. So Capablanca just waited. And Alekhine waited. King b5. Okay, so Alekhine could, of course, repeat the position. It's just a draw, but no. He wants to dive back to the king side. So this is the technique. You drag black's king over to the queen side with your king, and then you dive back. It's like the body swerve in football when you're trying to get round someone, or in rugby. You know, you dip one way, you'd go back the other and go round them. So the king is going to head back towards the king side and attack those pawns. Now, it's still not so easy because there's a rook here, which is going to try to prevent the king from coming in. Rook d6, check. King e5, rook e6, and king f4. Now, Alekhine takes the opportunity to blockade the pawn with his king. So it's now rook and pawns against king and pawns. So for the moment, white's rook stays there, protecting the pawn, making sure the king isn't going to move again. And white tries to break in with the king. Oh, I should mention that, yeah, in this position, if f6, then a6 is winning. Again, you have to calculate the pawn endgame, but here the king gets round just in time before black's king blocks out the king and scoops up all the pawns. Okay, so king a6, king g5. So the king is going to break through here. A check, king h6, rook f5. Did you notice how carefully Alekhine has played? He's made sure that his rook has come to, it was on a2, which guarded that pawn. Now, Alekhine played f4 here, which is a good move. He commented afterwards he thought king g7 was better. It's certainly a little bit more subtle. Let's go with king g7. So it's not the game continuation, but it is very instructive actually, because you can put black in Zugzwang here. So for example here, king g8, the rook has to keep hold of this pawn. If the f-pawn advances, then the king just comes back and takes g6. So rook f6, king f8, white is just waiting for the rook to move. King g7, rook f5, there's nothing better, and f4. And you can see black is in Zugzwang. The rook is going to have to move away, and then king takes pawn. That's very deft, very, very subtle maneuvering with the king. Very nice. I mean, there are alternatives there, but you've got the rough idea. White can force a Zugzwang. But Alekhine played f4 first. It's also winning, but it's a little bit different because now the rook runs away here. That's why it would have been better to play the king to g7 first to tie the rook to defending f7. So got to be a little bit careful about the rook coming here. So rook a3, guarding the pawn. Rook c7. king g7, so the king comes in. Rook d7. Okay, so how does white break? Well, it's this pawn that's useful again. Again, Alekhine prefers king f6, but f5, as he played, is winning. So let's concentrate on f5 because it's such a typical breakthrough to disturb that pawn chain. So obviously there's a threat to take on g6, so the pawn has to be taken. So now there are 3 isolated pawns. King h6, threatening this one. f4. I mean, if this is taken, then the king will just guide the h-pawn down the board. So f4 takes, and rook d5. Notice all the while that white's rook is in the perfect position, just making sure that black's king is completely stuck. If it moves, the a-pawn just advances. So we have this little kind of private battle on the king side between the king and the rook. Pawn threatened, rook f5. Pawn threatened, rook a4. So this is a kind of Zugzwang position. The rook can't move away. White would capture this. So king b5. Ah, okay. So the king wasn't completely stuck. Rook e4. Now, I've got to be careful because king takes pawn, rook e5 check transposes to a winning pawn endgame, so the king just came back. And king h6 played. Rook takes a5. Rook e5. So this rook move was coming anyway. Obviously the pawn endgame is winning for white, so the rook comes down. King h5. You can see that black's king is just so far away that there are no chances to save this game. The king comes over, but this is now a very important technique. If the black king were back here, then that can be a theoretical draw in the right position. So what do? You play rook e7, and you make sure that the black king is not returning to the king side. So it's cut along the e file. At this point, the game was adjourned, and Capablanca resigned the game and sent Alekhine a note congratulating him as the new world champion. Well, let's just finish this. Let's just make sure this is absolutely winning. So king d6. The king must try to come as close as possible to the pawns. So rook e8. So making sure that the king is still cut. Well, what can the rook do? There's a threat to advance this pawn. So let's say rook f1. Okay, the king comes over to protect the pawn. Nothing to do. The pawn would like to advance, so check. Why not go in front of the pawn? Rook h1. Okay, let's just give that pawn. The problem is that black's king and rook are the wrong way round. Basically, that king needs to be somewhere on the king side, and the rook needs to be checking laterally. And there just isn't room here. Now, first of all, let's push the king away again. So now there are 2 files distance to the pawn, and this is really easy. Basically, white is going to achieve the Lucena position, and if you're not quite sure how that wins, then well, you could do worse than check out my chess-based download. Yeah, basically, this is winning because black's king is so far away. So some really important techniques there, and I mean, how they ended up actually is a little bit like the Humpy against Divya game, where they ended up with, the pawns on this side of the board, on one side of the board, and the king basically breaking through. Let me see. Important techniques. So if possible, try to bring your rook behind the pawn. Then you march your king over, like this. Then, very important technique, when the rook came back here and you put black in Zugzwang. So either the king will go towards the pawn, or it'll come back this way. If it comes back that way, the king comes in. If it goes this way, then the king dives towards the king side. And then it's just a case of breaking in, which Alekhine did successfully with f5. Even though, as he wrote afterwards, perhaps he could have speeded things up a little bit. In fact, his technique was pretty typical. You break up those pawns and then you come in using the king and rook to clean everything up, basically. So there we go. As I said, if you truly understand that endgame, then that is a building block for basically all rook and pawn endgames. Good luck!